Girlfriend a long time ago, and I wanted to impress her by learning Russian, and that didn't last, so you can imagine what my Russian skills were like, because if you can't, if you don't understand, or if I speak too fast today, please don't hesitate to raise your hand and ask for me to clarify. I'm going to talk to you today about a topic that might not seem so important or so interesting. But if you are a student of international relations, if you are a student of political science, if you are a student of economics, it is impossible to understand the world today without understanding regional integration. That is the idea that national borders don't mean what they used to mean. I'll give you an example. I live in a city 100 kilometers from the Austrian border in Italy, 100 kilometers from the Brenner Pass. Now, if you know about history, the Brenner Pass and the space between the Brenner Pass and where I live, Trento, about 100 kilometers, for about 800 years, was the site of battles, wars. World War I was largely decided what happened in that space, apart from what happened in the Eastern Front. There isn't a place when I go walking in the mountains with my son where we do not find a site for a battle. We don't find old bullets. So the Brenner Pass between Austria and Italy historically has been strategically important. In 2015, in the middle of the immigration crisis, when about 1 million refugees tried to cross through Italy or through Greece into Europe, Austria decided to close or to reimpose borders because for the last 20 years, because of the Schengen Agreement, there are no borders. And immediately, on both sides, there were protests. So you think about that. 70 years after major wars at a pass, people were protesting not because people were crossing the border. They were protesting because they were closing the border. And that means something has changed. And who was protesting the most? Economic actors. Because now, if I have a factory on the Italian side of the border, my supplier is on the other side of the border, 10 kilometers away. I expect that I can cross this border easily and my factory doesn't have to wait 2 hours for the piece to come. That's what regional integration does. And so when we're talking and trying to think about the international system, we have to begin to try and understand what is this phenomenon. And it's a strange phenomenon because it's the opposite, or it seems like it's the opposite of globalization. Globalization says the whole world is your market. The whole world is interconnected. Regionalism says no. It's not the whole world. It's your neighbors. It's your region. It's your continent. So we have to ask ourselves, Is regional integration a reaction to this? Or is regional integration a step we take to really create this global market and this global political community? So, what I want to talk about today is show you how widespread the phenomena is without even knowing it, whether you're in Russia, whether you're in Thailand, whether you're in Brazil or in Italy. You are integrated into some kind of regional organization. And that regional organization probably has an impact on your life in an important way. Now, in my case, living in the European Union, the money I carry in my pocket, the passport I carry in my jacket reflect that. But in other parts of the world, it's just as important, or not just as important, but becoming important. So, what I'd like to do today is talk about this phenomenon and make the case that it's important for 2 or 3 reasons, especially important for students of international relations. It asks, because it forces us to ask a few questions. The first one is, are states really the only legitimate actors in the international system? Now, I think your course is about economics and transnational corporations, right? Now, you try and convince someone that a transnational cooperation is not an important international actor. Of course they are. But there's theories of international relations that say, no, only states matter. What we're going to talk about today is not only is it not only states that matter, but actors like transnational corporations are also important actors that help create regional integration. Because regional integration for a transnational corporation is perfect. Because if I have a factory in 2 or 3 countries, and I can move production across those borders with very few controls, that's perfect for me. If I have to stop at every border, maybe even pay duties on every border, to get that piece between my own different factories, then that's a cost for me. It's not a coincidence that the biggest supporters right from the 1950s of European integration, of the European Union, have been large transnational corporations. But not only transnational corporations, other parts of civil society, trade unions, environmental groups. If we want to deal with an environmental issue, the biggest obstacle you face is, apart from economic interest, the fact that you have a national border. Environmental issues don't respect borders. What regional integration does is gives you the opportunity to deal with an issue like environment across national borders. So the first thing we want to look at is, and address, is the questions that can there be other kinds of actors that aren't states and aren't transnational corporations in the international system, and can they change that system? And in the case of the European Union, in the case of the Eurasian Union, in the case of ASEAN, we'll see whether those nations, not the states, are able to change the system. The second issue we want to look at, and this is another issue that comes from international politics, and that's the one that says, in international relations, in international politics, international business, you can never trust anyone. the only one you can trust is your state. States don't trust each other. And if you trust somebody else, then you're condemned to lose. So the question is, does it necessarily mean that states are always going to conflict and possibly end up in war? Or can they cooperate? And when they cooperate, is it possible that both sides win? Because again, there's a theory of international relations, there's a theory from bargaining that comes from economics that says if you cooperate, somebody is going to lose. There's always somebody who wins, somebody who loses. Theories about integration, on the other hand, say that not only is it possible for states to cooperate, they do it because everybody wins. So I'll give you an example. Again, in the European Union and in Italy, we're having a big debate now about Germany. I don't need to tell Russians about debates about Germany. And the question is the European Union dominated by German interests? That is, that it's not possible that we could all be in the European Union and cooperate and we all win. Somebody has to win, and somebody is going to lose. And there's some people who argue that, no, it's always going to be Germany because Germany is the biggest, the most powerful economically. It's the one that's geographically central. On the other hand, we have others who argue it's not zero sum. It doesn't have to be that because Germany wins, we lose. And regional integration can work and will only work if everybody thinks that we will all win in some way. So, regional integration challenges the idea that states will always conflict and that there's no incentive to cooperate. The third issue we want to look at and address is whether by cooperating and integrating, we begin to change. We begin to change our behavior. We begin to change our interests and our incentives. Take an example from, if I'm a small business and I have a small factory in the north of Italy near the Austrian border, and I start to sell my products on the other side of this border. After a while, I'm selling so much on the other side of the border, I decide to find a partner on the other side. After a while, me and my partner discover that we're also selling a lot in the Czech Republic. So now we've deepened and we've widened this dynamic of relationships. The question then is, do states then have to begin to think differently about how they relate with Austria and the Czech Republic? And of course they do. I go back to the example of when Austria tried to close the Brenner Pass. Because their interests in society have changed. Businesses need that border open. So states no longer can think only in terms of how do I manage what takes place within my borders. What I also have to think about is how do I manage a relationship with another state, with 3 other states, with 27 other states. Because now we're so integrated that if I try to take something away from that relationship, I'm going to have a problem. This afternoon in the British Parliament, there's going to be a vote about Britain leaving the European Union. And the British, for all their democratic rights, in 2016 decided we're going to leave the European Union. Fine. Good for you. That's what we say in Italy. Good for you. Go. But what's happened? They didn't think, hold on, what about all that fruit that arrives every day? That arrives without having to stop at the border to check whether it has the right pesticide level, to check whether it meets all the health requirements, and so on. What about all that medicine that arrives every day? Because for the past 40 years, what have the British done? With 27 other partners, they have found a way to live together. Now, like in any separation, any divorce, the easiest thing is to decide to divorce. I'm leaving. Go. Then the lawyer comes, and you have to decide who's going to take care of the children, who's going to get the TV, who's going to get the car, who's going to get that CD that I fell in love with. When you start to get to these things, you begin to realize undoing that relationship is not that easy. And what has happened in the last 2 years in Britain? Yes, they've expressed their democratic right. But interests in society have started to say, hold on. Before we go, we need to know how we're going to be the day after. Because we have changed. We are not the Britain of 40 years ago. Everything we've done in the last 40 years, we've done with these other 27 people. Just like somebody who divorces his wife thinks, now I'm free. I'm going to go out and I can live the life I lived before. It's 20 years later. You can't do the things you did 20 years ago. Britain can't go back to 1975. It's changed. And, like all change, if you want to break it, it's going to come with costs. Now, that's not to say that Britain can't leave the European Union, but it just goes to show that integration changes you. It changes states because it changes the interests that are in society. So, that's what we want to take a look at. And finally, the question we want to ask is, we can do all these things. We're going to talk about all these examples we have of regional integration. We can do all these things, and when we do them, we might get some economic benefits, and there's no doubt that there's economic benefits. And there's societal benefits, personal benefits. In the European Union, we have Erasmus, which means my students, all of them get to spend a semester. They all want to go to Barcelona for 3 months. I don't know why. You can imagine why. But they get something from it. But the question is, whether what we get means we have to pay a cost. And that cost is, do we have to give up sovereignty? How much control do we give up when we open the border between Austria and Italy? Because Austria wanted to close the border for a reason. They wanted to control who came in and who came out. and who and control migration. Or you want to gain control of your economy again, because now you can't decide how you spend money or not. So, is there a trade-off? Okay, so if we can go to the first slide, please. This is one map of the world. In this map, what we have are different forms of economic integration. And as you can see from the map, there isn't anywhere on the globe, at least in terms of these economic communities, except for China, that right now in this map, we'll see other ones, we'll see that China is in them. There's very few parts of the world that don't have some kind of economic integration. Next slide. If we take a look at this map as maybe concentrating more on security questions, then we find again that almost every part of the world is involved in some kind of security arrangement with somebody else. What that means is every discussion I have about security involves speaking, collaborating, cooperating with somebody else. If I'm in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, I know who I have to speak to. If I'm in NATO, and so on. So we can have arrangements that are economic in nature. We can have arrangements that are primarily about security. If we go to the next slide, we can have arrangements that are primarily about political cooperation. In the Americas, there's the Organization of American States that's been around for over 60 years that deals with political questions. If you have Venezuela in the middle of a humanitarian crisis and you have Venezuelans crossing your borders, what do? You can have bilateral relationships, or as an organization, you can deal with those kinds of questions. Same issue in Africa and other parts of the world. So, all of this to say that regional agreements cover the entire globe. And it's a phenomena that has been essentially in the last 25 years. Now, if you look at this graph, nothing really seems to happen until the late 1980s. And then in the first part of the 1990s, it explodes. What happened in that period? What do you think is responsible?
Amazon.
Pardon me?
Amazon.
It was a bit later, but it's a good.
Socialist bloc has.
Yeah, the end of the Cold War. That explains the period after 1988. A little bit, it starts to rise. But if we look at the real explosion, it's a little bit later. You're right to say what happened later couldn't have happened without the fall of the Berlin Wall, but something else happened.
Perhaps the creation of international economic societies and organizations.
The creation of the WTO as the starting point, because the WTO told transnational economic actors, like the transnational corporations that you deal with in your course, that we have a global economy now. Don't think nationally anymore. don't even think that you can be successful without looking beyond your national border. And so we begin to think differently about the global economy. And what happens? States all of a sudden look at the world and say, now we don't have the instruments to protect ourselves anymore. When I signed the WTO, what I said and what I committed myself to, this is why Donald Trump doesn't like it, is international law will now decide what transnational corporations can do, what global economic actors could do. Because what the WTO agreement says is, I can't treat your companies any different than I treat mine when we're trading goods. And not only that, I can't subsidize my companies to compete on a global scale anymore. So all of a sudden, national governments could no longer have the certainty that they could protect their economies. So they had two choices. One choice is to say, oops, we made a mistake. We're going to close ourselves off. And nobody really chose that route because they understood that there were economic costs for that. The other one was, okay, this situation so that my economic actors can be ready to compete on a global scale. And one way you do that is to say, okay, we start to deal on a regional basis. Because my corporations, my economic actors might not be ready to compete globally. But if they start to build their market on a regional basis, if they start to face competition regionally, that'll get them ready. And maybe what might begin to emerge are regional kinds of transnational economic actors. So they start to get the scale that's big enough to compete globally. And so what happens between the middle of the 1990s and now, the number of regional trade agreements has exploded. And we have close to over 300 of them. And these are maybe just smaller agreements on specific industries, or maybe they're major trade agreements like the one the United States, Mexico, and Canada renegotiated, like the Eurasian Economic Union, and other organizations and agreements that have come around in Asia and including Africa. So in the 1990s, we decided, and states from every part of the world made a political choice. And like you said, important in that was the end of the Cold War. But also important in that was changes in China, which wanted very much to join and become part of this global economy. And the emergence of China has been pushing a lot of states in the direction of regional trade agreements to be ready to compete against and with China. So there's a historical phenomena that we want to try and understand. So why compare regions? We've already, in a little bit, we talked about. The next two things we want to look at are, what are we comparing, and what do regions do? So, doesn't make sense to compare regional integration in the European Union with integration in the Eurasian Economic Union or with ASEAN in Asia and so on. So we will want to look at those last two questions. Please, next slide. No, next one. We've talked about this. Thank you. Okay, so this global phenomena, and one important point about this phenomena, and this is important for students of international relations, but also for people in business, is that it's a multilateral phenomenon. Now, there's an important difference between a multilateral and a bilateral relationship, because in a bilateral relationship, the power differences that might exist between two actors becomes more important. But if I want to deal with a large economic actor or a large political and military actor, what I want to do is commit them to some kind of multilateral agreement where there's lots of other parties involved. I'll give you an example. And why the WTO is so important for small states. About 15 years ago, when the internet was just taking off, the small country of Antigua in the Caribbean got into a dispute with the United States. Do you know what there is in Antigua that would get the United States all upset? Antigua was the place where the computer servers were for, at the time, most of the online gambling companies. So all the online gambling, or not all of it, but about 80% of it, at the beginning of the 2000s, was based in Antigua. So Americans were betting online with companies that were based in Antigua, but in the United States, computer-based and online gambling is illegal. So, the United States took action against Antigua, saying, you are providing an illegal service, and so therefore we will take action against you in terms of economic costs and so on. Antigua said, hold on, we signed the WTO agreement just like you. In the WTO agreement, it says you cannot treat foreign economic actors differently than you treat your own. And Antigua's argument was, you can gamble in the United States, so why are you picking on us? The United States says, we don't care. Take us to the WTO. They went to the WTO, and the WTO found that Antigua was right. Now, if it was just the United States against Antigua, as we say in Italian, Antigua would have been fried. Because it has an economy 10,000 times the economy of Antigua. It has the military power, but they were part of a multilateral agreement. And the United States had an incentive in making sure the WTO works. Not because of its relationship with Antigua, but because of its relationship with China, its relationship with Europe, and the rest of the global economy. So it needs the WTO to work. So it has to respect the WTO. So, just to finish that story, the WTO said Antigua is right, and Antigua has been damaged by up to $2 billion a year. $2 billion is nothing to the Americans. They could have paid that like that. But what did the WTO ruling say? What Antigua could do is, from its computer servers, release free copies of Microsoft software, all the major software, including free electronic copies of movies and music, up to $2 billion. The WTO had not even finished writing its sentence, and arriving in Washington was Bill Gates, the head of all the Hollywood studios, saying, you have to respect the WTO decision, or else we are going to lose through all of this copies of the copyright that we have to suspend through Antigua. So, the example shows that multilateral organizations, like regional organizations, are useful ways to deal with power differences in the international system. If you're a small state, it means the big state now has to respect the same laws as you. Of course, those laws are always done to protect the interests of the big state, but at least they're laws. And the big state has to respect them, not because of the small states, but because of all the other states put together. They want everybody to be playing by those rules. And if they don't start to respect them, then those rules begin to fall apart. So, regionalism is one of the most effective ways of multilateral action. If I give you the example of the European Union, Europe's problem, historic problem, has always been Germany. Huge, large powers sitting right in the middle of Europe. And the only way you can deal with that is to take away the incentives for Germany to exert its power unilaterally. And that's exactly what European integration tried to do. And Germany had an interest, and continues to have an interest, because it needs the other 27 to trade and for finance reasons. Okay, please go to the next slide. Actually, we'll slip ahead because we're... okay. When we talk about regional integration, we're gonna see at the end, we're gonna talk about something called new regionalism. And again, for you who are studying transnational corporations, it's really important, because the new regionalism, it was really and is really about creating the conditions for economic actors to move across borders regionally as freely as possible. And that's the dynamic that we find in places like ASEAN, in the Central American Free Trade Agreement, the US, Mexico, Canada Agreement, and so on. And I would add to that the Eurasian Economic Union. They've also been agreements that increasingly bring together states from the north, or industrialized states, and developing economies. If we think of something like APEC, the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation, we have in that organization Russia, Canada, United States, but also Latin American countries, Asian developing economies. All of a sudden, we have large, powerful economic actors entering and cooperating with states from developing economies. So it's not just industrialized states, or it's not just developing states, but it's a different dynamic between developing and emerging economies. Please, next slide, please. Next one. Okay. But what is a region? Is not just a simple question. It's not a banal question. When we think of regions, what comes to mind? What do you think of a region?
Non-formal union of maybe members which can cooperate to each other.
So members who are going to cooperate with each other. Sorry.
Troubles like crime or violence or poverty.
It could be.
Ignorance.
It could be issues that drive me, but my question is even more specific. If I close my eyes and I think region, what do I see?
Geographic states.
Geographic, yeah.
Yeah, states which share some historical territory, area.
So we think that we have a space that where there's states that have emerged over time, but now have decided to cooperate maybe because of those issues like poverty, crime, or may emerge because of that cooperation. So when we think of region, our immediate reaction is to think that they at least share some kind of physical space. That would be the logical and rational thing to think. But then if I look at something like APEC, and I say the Asia-Pacific region, and there I have a region that goes from the North Pole to the South Pole on 2 different hemispheres. Right? And that geographic continuity is not there. When I think of NATO as a regional organization, that doesn't have geographic continuity. So, you're right to say most cases of regional integration are about spaces that maybe even have a historical link. The Eurasian Economic Union obviously is one based on a historical link. But it doesn't necessarily have to be about that geographic continuity. So what we're trying to do and what we want to try and find is a definition of a region that captures not only those historical, geographic, policy issues that hold people together, but also captures something that takes place across continents or across oceans. And because we are starting to think about regions across oceans, a major agreement between the Trans-Pacific Agreement between Canada and some Latin American states with some of the Asian states is a major step towards creating a free trade area across the Pacific Ocean. That's a region. And here the fundamental point is states were created. Right? States weren't born in nature. Societies created states, created borders, and decided that this is the kind of political organization we're going to have with these borders. Those same societies can also decide that on this space there's something else besides the state. There's something called a region. And that region could be for economic reasons, it could be for security reasons, it could be for policy reasons, but it's a political process that might be pushed by society, or it might be a way in which we want to change society's preferences. Please, next slide. So, what are the factors that might contribute to creating a region? Geographic proximity. So the point about sharing borders or sharing maybe a continental space like Central Asia, like Eurasia, Europe, North America. It might be simply, the second point, mutual interdependence. We both need each other. Maybe we need each other to fight poverty. Maybe we need each other to fight transnational crime, environmental issues. We can't do it on our own. Or maybe we need each other to facilitate trade. So we begin to think about this geographic space not just simply in terms of national borders and national states. There's a third element, though, and this is something we'll come back to towards the end, and that's the whole question about cultural identity or cultural affinity. That is, that not only do we have to share a space to create a region, not only do we need to have shared interests, we also need to have some maybe historical link, some cultural link. It could be religious, it could be language. For instance, important organizations, and we can call them regional organizations. One example is the Francophonie. That is a group of states that have in common the French language. Some are in Africa, some are in North Africa, some are in Europe, and some are in North America and Asia. That creates a basis for cooperation between states. So they might have some kind of cultural link that holds them together as well. Okay. So, actually, we can skip the next few slides because we're running close on time, and we'll get to. I'll tell you. Keep going, please. One more. Okay. So, we have a group of states, members who share, have agreed to cooperate, maybe because they have geographic proximity, they have same interests, same issues to deal with, maybe they have the same kind of identity. But we have an important issue to solve, is what's the difference between cooperation and integration? And this is not just simply playing with words. It's not something just for international law. It makes a big difference in the real world, especially in the world of business. So, by cooperation, we simply mean that we're talking about limited economic, political, maybe security arrangements and agreements, where states say, we will try to facilitate relationships with each other. There's no objective here to go beyond that limited cooperation. We're not trying to change anyone's preferences. We're not trying to change how society works, how society thinks. Maybe we don't even want transnational corporations to start thinking too much in terms of the region. We just want to solve maybe a little problem. Integration is something else. And this is an important maybe distinction that we beginning to see in the Eurasian Economic Union, which is more than just cooperation. It is about integration. And if we can go to the next slide, please. Next one right after this is integration is the bringing together. So with cooperation, I don't want to bring together. I just want to cooperate with you. With integration, I'm now beginning to think about creating something new. A third thing. There's you, there's me, and there's what we've created. European Union, Eurasian Union, Economic Union, and so on. And it begins to bring together groups in society. And it's not just limited by national borders and national identity. Now, this can happen, and it does happen, without having to say it. Because if you sign something like the Maastricht Treaty in Europe, or you create something like the Eurasian Economic Union, and you say that the objective here is to go beyond national identity, to give up national sovereignty, everyone will say no. Because our instinct is not to change. We are France, we are Italy, we are Argentina. Why should I enter into something that wants to make me into something else? So all of these arrangements never state that their objective is to stop being what they are. The famous line in the Treaty of Rome that created the European Union was to create an ever closer union. That's all. Not to create Europeans, not for national states to be something less, just to create an ever closer union. But integration, though, is a process where even if you don't say it, it happens. It happens because actors start to change. So please, next slide. So integration is, we can take a narrow definition, but if we go to the next slide, we'll take the classic historic definition of integration, and where political actors in several distinct national settings are persuaded to shift their loyalties. And they're not persuaded because we signed a treaty. They're persuaded because it's in their interest to do it. I'm persuaded to go on an Erasmus, not because I'm forced to go on, but because if I want a career in international business, international law, or any kind of business or law, I need to have that kind of experience. I'm beginning to shift. No one forced me to do it. But it's my own rational thinking that says, if I don't do this, because the world is changing, the world has changed, then I will pay a cost. So this is what this idea of being persuaded to shift loyalties, it's not by coercion. It's simply by creating the condition whereby expectations begin to change. And so that dynamic then begins to change society, and then begins, we'll see in a moment, begins to change political structures and institutions. All right. Are there any questions? Yeah? Okay, please, next slide. Actually, can we just skip ahead and we'll just start to look at, and we can skip these next 2 or 3, and we'll look at what, okay. So finally we want to look at, so what do these regional organizations do? What are they? And why might they be important? The first is, at the very minimum, they are a political arena. It's where states at least have an opportunity to come together and maybe argue or find common solutions to common problems. So if we're Latin American states and we have a problem like Venezuela, the Organization of American States is a forum, it's an arena, where we as regional actors can maybe try and help find a solution. Second point, and perhaps more important and more useful, is that they are instruments. They're not an end in themselves. They are something that we use. States or transnational corporations or citizens that they use to simply pursue their objectives and their goals. So there's no, as an individual, I'm not interested in what's the final political outcome. What I'm interested in is being able to travel freely across the border. Or I'm able to sell my steel across borders without stopping. And finally, what regional organizations are, not just arenas, not just instruments, they are actors. They begin to assert, they begin to demand, they begin to make requests on the international system as regions, not anymore as states, not anymore as just a group of states, but as a region. So the European Union, the Eurasian Economic Union, begins to be an actor in the international system. And that changes the international system completely. It's no longer about states competing and maybe in conflict. It is now about interests trying to find something in common. Please. Okay. So, what do regional organizations do? And maybe in your course you've already come across the Balassa classification of different ways in which we can integrate economically, which then might lead us to some kind of political integration. So Balassa was an economist who was looking at, in the 1970s and 80s, at different forms of integration. And he said, what we start off with, and the most basic agreement that we have, is a preferential trade agreement. That is, I just agree with you that I'm going to treat you differently than I treat the rest of the world. So you can sell your products, and everybody else, their cars come in at 20% tariff. I'll give you 10%. That's the most basic kind of trade arrangement that we can have bilaterally or multilaterally. What that graph we saw take off, those numbers that took off in the 1990s, was that second step, if you want to call it that, is a free trade agreement. And that is when a group of states decide themselves industry against your competitor. Somebody else tries to import, yes. In a free trade agreement, I can't put tariffs on Volkswagen. But if a Japanese car comes in, then I do. So, the next step in integration, economic integration, goes one step further. Because what happens with free trade is that goods start to cross borders, right? And we then have a problem. And that problem is, I'm part of a free trade agreement. I import cars from Japan, and I put 10% tariff on them. But you put 20% tariff. So what happens? I might start to begin to import cars at 10%, and then they might begin to travel freely to your country at 10%. So I have an unfair advantage. So what happens, and what happened in the case of the European Union, what's happening in ASEAN, what's proposed to happen in the African Union, is you create a customs union. What a customs union says is that we will now deal with the rest of the world in the same way. That means we will have the same commercial relationship with everybody else. What does this mean in practice? It means that you no longer have your own trade policy. I can't decide on my own anymore to have an agreement with Mexico if I'm in the European Union. I can't. Because trade policy is now part of the customs union. All 28 member states have to have the same agreement with all the other member states. So there's only one trade policy. So a customs union is going one step further. Balassa says, well, if you have a customs union, now everything is moving freely in terms of trade. It's not very efficient competing with the rest of the world, because now you're competing as one against the rest of the world. It makes sense to have a single market, because it's inefficient for me to produce something within my own market where I have barriers when I'm dealing with the rest of the world as a single actor. So then what do? Then you remove all the economic barriers between you. So really banal things. In a customs union, if I'm a doctor and I get certified as a doctor in my country, I'm not free to go to another country in that customs union to practice as a doctor. This was the European Union before the 1990s. Now, because we've created a single market in Europe, as a doctor, my license is recognized throughout the European Union. In the same way as the car part that I make or the fruit that I grow travels across the border without any controls. Then Balassa says, hold on. If you have a single market, it doesn't make sense that you don't have the same currency. Right? Because everything is now traveling, there's no economic borders, but if I go from Italy to Germany, I have to convert my currency. And not only that, because things are moving without any barriers, those Italians might devalue their currency by 20%, and now all of a sudden a Fiat is 20% cheaper than a Volkswagen. And I can't do anything to stop that competition. So I should create a single currency. So we now have an economic and monetary union. Balassa then says, if you have a single market with a single currency and an economic union, you need to have one political structure that governs it. And so you end up with a political union. Now, in economics, these are not presented as stages. They're simply said, these are the different ways in which we can have regional economic integration. Very simple preferential trade agreement, all the way to a political union. I'm a political scientist. Political scientists look at this and say, this isn't just a description of different kinds. This might be a process that each step I take might lead me to the next one. And if I look at the history of the European Union or the history of ASEAN, I see that what happened with each decision they took to go one step further, they saw that they needed to go to the next step. Otherwise, it didn't make sense to be where they were. It doesn't make sense to have a customs union and not have a single market. So, if you follow the debate about Brexit, that's exactly what they're going to decide this afternoon. Whether they stay in the customs union. And if they stay in the customs union, means that Britain can't sign trade agreements with anybody else. But then they say, but if we stay in the customs union, we're not going to get the benefits of the single market, so we may as well stay in the European Union. So this is a dynamic process that takes place. Let's see how much time we have. Please, next slide. Okay. When we look at what regions do, we talk about two different dimensions. And this is useful and important if we're trying to assess something like the Eurasian Economic Union. One of them is the scope, or how wide that integration is, in terms of how many members we have. And the second is called the depth. How deep is that integration? Please, next slide. And I don't know if you can see. Oops. Back. Can we go back one? Yeah. Okay. So the first one is the widening is the scope. Who are the members of this? How far does it extend? And does the process create so many incentives that others want to join? So, in the case of the European Union, it started with 6, 9, 12, 15, 25, 27, 28. That's a widening process. And we ask ourselves, why is there this pressure? Why is there this widening? And it probably has something to do with the more it widens, the more consequences there are for other states. And the greater are the costs for them to stay out. So, if I have a trading relationship with a state, and we've been trading and maybe even have some kind of trade arrangement or preferential trade arrangement, but all of a sudden that state decides to join a regional union. It's like having a girlfriend who decides to go with somebody else. Because now you can't have that preferential relationship with her anymore. Because they're in a union that says you have to look this way, not there. And so now there's economic interests in here who are saying to the state, you have to do something. You have to begin to hook on to that union. So that's the pressure for widening. The second dimension of regional integration is what we call deepening. And deepening means two things. One is what we say functional. That is, we may start with an agreement that's very narrow. Say we're going to have an agreement that only deals with coal and steel. And then you realize, after a few years, you say, well, hold on. Coal and steel is really important for industry. So maybe we have to go a little bit deeper and say it's coal and steel and industry. But then you realize, you say, well, hold on. If it's coal and steel and industry, that's a big part of our economy. How are we going to move these things? It's no use to have a union that's based on coal and steel, and I have my railroad tracks that are this wide, and yours are that wide, and then, so when my train comes to your border, which is supposed to be open now for coal and steel, it has to stop, we have to unload it. So maybe we need to do coal, steel, industry, and transportation. Then you start to say, hold on, if it's coal, steel, industry, and transportation, what about agriculture? That's an important part of our economy. And so there's this dynamic that says the more you integrate, even if you start with a couple of functions, the pressure will be to spill over into something other functions. And so integration becomes deeper and deeper and deeper. And the more you go on, the deeper it gets. That leads to another kind of deepening in what we call authority. That is, if I have a union that's just coal and steel, we say, okay, but how are we going to govern this? Well, we're going to govern this by, we'll create an authority. We'll call it an authority, or we'll call it the commission. And it's just going to deal with coal and steel. So that's fine. But then you have coal and steel and industry. Say, okay, this commission now is going to deal with coal, steel, and industry. But now you have industry and transportation. Coal, steel, industry, transportation. You now have an authority at the regional level that is beginning to touch every part of political economic and social life within your borders. And so the argument here is, as there's a functional spillover, so it goes from one function to the next, there's a political and an authority spillover where we begin to look more and more to this regional level for decisions to govern this relationship. And so we begin to see what we saw before as that definition of integration, a beginning of the transferring of preferences, expectations, and even political authority. So, again, we use the case of the European Union to illustrate. European Union begins as the European Coal and Steel Community. 1951. By 57, they become the European Economic Community. By the late 1960s, they become a customs union. By 1992, they become a single market. Deepening of functions. By 1999, an economic and monetary union with the single currency. Each step of the way has meant also a change in political authority. More and more decisions now that affect people every day are made by states and by European institutions at the European level. So that's what we mean by a deepening of authority. Okay, last two slides. Last thing I want to talk about are regional identities and why they might be important. And the point that was raised before about maybe there's a historical legacy, historical links, and that's important sometimes. But history can play both ways, because maybe those historical links were about war. So if you're France and Germany, the historical links aren't maybe, yes, you were linked historically, but maybe by conflict. But regional identities become important when you have deepening. Because at the European level, or at the ASEAN, that affect you. And if you don't feel something, you don't feel that you identify with this regional group, then you're going to begin to ask, but why am I having to give up something because of this region? Why am I having to do this because Europe is telling me to do it? So, if I feel an identity with it, you begin to say, I'm not having to do this because I'm Italian. I'm doing this because I'm European. Now, why does the European Union spend tens of millions of euros every year on Erasmus? Because they want to create a regional identity. If I go to Barcelona for a semester from Italy, and I share a room with somebody from Poland and from Portugal, I come back from that a different person. Maybe I find my future wife on Erasmus. 2 years ago, European Union had a big celebration. I don't know how they figured this out. They said they had identified the millionth Erasmus. They somehow figured out how many people met their future spouse on Erasmus and got married and had children. Now, if you think of that child, my mother's Danish, my father is Greek, They met in Amsterdam. I was born in London, but now we live in Paris. What am I? Am I Danish? Am I Greek? I lost track of where they were. That child is European. All the surveys, every single survey shows anybody who's been on Erasmus or has a university education, which meant they probably traveled around Europe, has a higher level of identification with Europe than with their national state. Any child of a mixed Europe-EU couple has a higher level of identification with Europe than they do with a member state. It's physiological. How can I be any more Danish, any more Greek, if I was born in Amsterdam but I'm living in Paris? Makes sense for me to say Europe, of course, because I speak 4 languages. I travel freely. My grandparents are here, are there, and so on. That's what regional identities shape. Now, that's what we said at the beginning about integration, changing expectations, changing the way people define their interests. Now, this is the theory. Whether it happens in practice, in many ways, it does. It's happened for business. It's happened for economic interests. And that's the same in the EU. It's happening in the Eurasian Union. It's happened in ASEAN. It's happened in North America. And so on. And in terms of regional identities, in some cases, it's beginning to happen. But we also know that there's a backlash because regional integration creates winners just as much as it creates losers. Okay, I stop at 4:15. Okay, I have a couple more things to say. I'll say one last thing. In the last issue, and this is one of the ones I started with, is the question of sovereignty. That is, if you change expectations, if you change the behavior of actors, especially economic actors, it becomes harder for you to hold on to sovereignty. Because if my economic actors are telling me, don't put up this border, I need to trade with them. I need for them to send their products here. I need workers to move across borders freely. If they're telling me to do that, then I have to begin to accept what happens beyond my borders. And I have to begin to give up sovereignty. And that's not an easy thing to do. And that's where we have many political conflicts and will continue to have political conflicts in the future. And I'll stop there. I'm sorry I can't give this lecture in Russian. I would like to, but I'm too old to learn new languages. So I will try to not speak very fast, but if you have any questions, please raise your hands and ask if something is not clear. Today I was asked to come and talk to you about theories of regional integration. And I remember when I was a student of political science, when I would look at the syllabus at the beginning of the semester for a course, with the list of all the lectures, when I would see the word theories, I would say, that's a class I'm going to miss. Because I would say theories are boring. It's not about the real world. It's just professors who imagine how the world should be. I want to know how things work. Luckily, that was a mistake, and luckily I didn't pay great consequences, because we all need theories. We all have theories. You never go somewhere in a car to drive where you have never been without the map, right? I know you're going to say, you're young, you're going to say, well, GPS, I don't need a map. But the GPS is your map. A theory is a map. It's the map that we have to understand the world. And I understand in your course you're looking at Eurasian integration, regional integration. It's a complex question. It's a very difficult question if you start to think about all the different aspects. Political aspects, social aspects, security aspects, strategic, cultural, historical. And if you just look at the territory, right, you just say all of these things, culture, history, economics, politics, and so on, I can't understand anything. It's too much. I need a map. I need a way to understand what's going on here. And this is what theories do. So, please do not make the mistake I did, and when you see theories, you forget, because then you will go try to understand politics without a map. And you will, it's nice sometimes, and I was saying to Konstantin, tomorrow I want to go explore Moscow on my own, because it's nice sometimes to get lost, but when you have an intellectual problem, it's good to have a map. And you all have a map about international relations. Maybe you don't know it, but you have a map. And what I want to do today is very briefly talk a little bit about what are the key questions we ask in international relations and what theories might do to help us answer those questions. And then we'll start talking about regional integration. And when we talk about regional integration, we're going to do basically three things. First, I'm going to talk a little bit about what is it that we're talking about when we talk about regional integration. Right? You're studying Eurasian integration. What does it mean? Does it simply mean easy trade across borders? Does it mean that now we begin to think differently about politics and so on? We need to understand what we mean both by this word regional and by the word integration. And we won't spend too much time on that. So that's the first thing we'll do very briefly. And then what we'll do is look at some of the main theories that we've had that have tried to understand why we've had regional integration. Why is it that states agree to begin to cooperate and become more interdependent? And then the third thing what I'll try and do is, as much as possible, give comparative examples. Obviously, I come from Italy, so my experience of regional integration is the European Union. And I carry European integration in my pocket because I have euros. I carry a passport that says Europe. So it is very much present for me every day. So, but I'll try and also give you other examples where the theories help us understand what is going on. So, let's start with what are the important questions we ask in international relations. And the reason I start with international relations is because even though we are talking about regional integration, we are talking about the international system. We are talking about states. States that have borders. And they have borders, and they start to say, let's open them like this, a little bit. And maybe sometimes they start to go like that. And then maybe they keep going. And it becomes like the European Union, where there's no borders anymore. But there's still states, still sovereign states. So we're still dealing with international relations. So the big problems and the big questions we ask in international relations are the same questions we have to ask when dealing at regional integration. And this is where it gets interesting and it gets fun. Because regional integration raises big headaches for some international relations scholars. Because regional integration goes against the logic of most of international relations thinking, both in terms of theory and in terms of practice. And here I'm going to give a little parenthesis back to my story about me not going to international relations theories classes. That was a big mistake, not just because I had to catch up after. It was a big mistake because in international relations, the difference between theory and practice doesn't really exist. Everybody who practices international relations, ministers of foreign affairs, diplomats, people in international business, have a theory of international relations. The classic example I always give is one of the most important diplomats or foreign policy practitioners of the post-war period, not only in the United States but globally, is Henry Kissinger. Henry Kissinger, do you know what he did before he became a diplomat? Was a professor of international relations, and he was a student. He wrote his PhD thesis with somebody named Morgenthau. And Hans Morgenthau wrote the most important textbook on international relations in 1948. It's now into its 8th edition or 9th edition. It's been translated into about 70 different languages. And he put forward the theory of realism. And we'll talk about this in a moment. So when Kissinger went to work for Nixon, he wasn't just a diplomat, or he wasn't just a professor with a theory. He put the two together. And everybody does this. And we'll see when we talk about different ideas people have about regional integration. When Prime Minister May gets up in the House of Commons today talking about Brexit, she has her theory of regional integration. And those who want to stay in the European Union, in Britain, have their own theory. And we'll see, and I'll show you when we talk about the theories, what those theories are, and why the two can't come together. That's one of the problems with theories. If we stick to our theories, it's like religion. If you're a realist, I'm a liberal, it's going to be hard for us to find common ground. But that's because we have two different maps. So when I get in the car with my wife to drive someplace, I listen to the GPS, she has a map, and we argue. Because her map tells her to go this way, the GPS tells me to go that way. That's what happens when we have different theories. Okay, so, quickly, what are the big questions we ask in international relations and international relations theories? Who are the most important actors? Is it just states? Is it multinational corporations? Is it social movements? Is it people? So we'll see, again, when we talk about the theories, some theories say there's only one actor in the international system, and that's states. Because states are the only ones that have sovereign power. So that's the first question. Second question is, can states create the conditions where we can have perpetual peace? So if you know from, maybe if you've done courses in political philosophy or philosophy, Immanuel Kant in the 18th century wrote a book where he said, we can have perpetual peace. And that was different from the argument of Hobbes, which says human beings and also states are selfish. They're rational and they are selfish. They pursue their own interests. So in pursuing their own interests, they will clash. They will conflict. So, in terms of this second question, can we create peace, or are we condemned to permanently have always conflict? And if you go work in a ministry of foreign affairs or a ministry of defense, the answer you give to that question will make a big difference when you sit down and negotiate with another state. Because if I think that everybody is only rational and selfish, so they're thinking only about their interests, then I'm going to negotiate differently if I think there's a way for us to cooperate so that everybody wins. We can create the right institutions for us not to be in conflict, but to be perpetually in peace. So, thinking about theories, it's useful for you if you start to think about 3 I's. First is interests. Do I think that actors, states, social actors, but we're talking about international relations, states are only and primarily driven by their self-interest? And that can't change. Okay? And if I think that, then I'm likely going to think that the world is a place where I always have to be ready for conflict, where there will always be the possibility of war. And I can't trust anybody. On the other hand, if I think we can create the conditions for perpetual peace, we can create the institutions that will help us cooperate, that we can trust each other. I can trust another state. I'll give you an example of the 2 differences. France and Germany, between 1870 and 1945, had 3 major wars. 2 of them were major European conflicts, World War I and World War II. So, if I think that the international system is just about interests, I can understand why France and Germany went to war, and I would think that after 1945, the possibility that France and Germany would go to war would always be there. Because their interests haven't changed. They shouldn't trust each other. They shouldn't cooperate. Today, France and Germany share military commands. Their governments, not just the prime ministers or the political leaders, ministers, civil servants, meet at least once a month to discuss joint policy. There's no border between them. They share a single currency, and so on and so on. They created institutions. But those interests didn't go away. But now they have these institutions. So, first big question is, who are the actors? Second, what drives the actors? And does that mean conflict or cooperation? And we can think of either interests or institutions. And the third question we could ask is, and this is really central to regional integration, is does cooperation, and integration is a form of cooperation, begin to change the way states behave? So, I don't trust you. You don't trust me. Because you're a rational actor, I'm a rational actor, we have different interests. But we have this little thing in common that we have to solve. I don't know. We have a river that goes from one country to the next. And we have to manage this together. So we start to cooperate. And the question is, as we begin to cooperate, does it begin to change the way we perceive the other? Does it begin to change the way we perceive or understand our interests? And the more I cooperate, maybe I have to cooperate with them more and more. And the more I cooperate with them, the more I start to think like them. And so now, this difference of interest isn't there anymore. Because our ideas are the same. So the last set of theories we have, the third eye, is ideas. Can we change the international system and create order because we begin to understand it in the same way? And we do that because we started to cooperate and we've started to integrate. So, not because I think the European Union is the greatest thing that ever happened and all of those things, but I'm going to use a lot of examples about the European Union to show these different theories and these theories of international relations and theories of regional integration, simply because the European Union is the one that has gone the furthest in this respect. And I think one of the challenges or one of the interesting things for you in your course, I think, will be, as you go through the course, is to begin to see, is this happening in the Eurasian Union? Can this happen in the Eurasian Union? Of course we can't compare the Eurasian Union today to the European Union after 70 years. Let's go back to where the European Union was in 1960. In 1966. If you know, there was a French president at the time, De Gaulle, who, never mind Theresa May or Thatcher as being anti-Europe, De Gaulle was a very impressive obstacle. But 70 years later, the French president last week made a speech where he said, we have to have more Europe. We haven't gone far enough. We have to have common immigration policy, common tax policy, so on and so on. So, when you're going through your course, it's useful to look at what happened in the European Union, but more importantly is to see whether what is happening in Eurasia fits into some of these dynamics and what that might mean for the future. Okay. Last thing I want to say in terms of general terms, and then we'll start going through these things. In terms of theories, theories give us the tools to ask and to give answers to the questions of who is doing what, where, and more importantly, because this is why we're here, we don't only want to describe, we want to understand. So we want to give an explanation as to why something happened. Why is there a Eurasian Union in 2019? Why do sovereign states decide to create economic integration? Why today, not 10 years ago? Is it simply a memory of the past? Are there interests? Have we created institutions? So theories will help us answer those questions. Okay, so that's that's a very long introduction. Okay, so what are we talking about when we talk about integration? And the classic definition comes from this book called The Uniting of Europe by somebody named Ernst Haas, and we'll talk about him again shortly, because he provided one of the theories we're going to talk about. And it's useful to look at this definition because it helps us understand that we're talking about more than just cooperation. Right? It's not just two states that come together and say, let's be friends, maybe we can do some kind of bilateral agreement. Regional integration is something much more. So, it's different national contexts. And here are some key words here. Persuaded to move their loyalty, expectations, and political activities to a new center. So, what we're talking about is a new political structure. It's not a state, but it's not an international organization either, in the classic sense, whose institutions possess or demand jurisdiction over pre-existing national states. The end result of a process of political integration is a new political community superimposed on the new one. So that's the end result that might happen from integration. But what Haas is saying is, we don't have, it's not A and B that decide to cooperate. Regional integration means A and B create something new called C. And that C, and this is what we're going to ask, that C might change how states behave. It might change how social actors behave. Let me give you a concrete example. If you have the Eurasian Economic Union and you have some kind of manufacturing industry in Kazakhstan, now, when you think about what is your market, it's no longer just Kazakhstan. It's the entire Eurasian Union. Right? Because you now have a new center that makes it possible for you to be an economic actor, not in A or B, but in this new reality. And so what Haas is saying is integration is a process where more and more our expectations are that this new structure that I've created will give us answers to our policy questions, to our economic questions, our environmental questions. So, if we take the case of the European Union, we have an issue with immigration. We no longer say, what is my government doing about immigration? In Italy, our debate about immigration is not about what happens in Italy. It was about what's going on in Europe. This is what Haas means when actors are persuaded to move their expectations. I know we can't solve immigration in Italy. My expectation is that we solve it at the European level. That's a major change. That means my state that has authority over me is sovereign. I'm saying, you can't solve my problems. you can't solve my economic problems. You can't solve my immigration problems. You can't solve my security problems. I'm looking somewhere else. That's integration. When that starts to happen. Of course it doesn't happen to that extent where I look to the new jurisdiction or this new sea for everything right away. It takes time. This is what Haas is saying. But it can take place. So, what we're going to theorize is this process. Is it really like Haas says? And if it is, how does it happen? So, one way to think about it is it's a circle. So with all circles, there's no beginning and there is no end. But wherever you start, it takes you in that direction. Right? So, let's say we start with economic interdependence, or deciding to make your economies closer in a geographic area, like Eurasia. Regionalization and regional integration means that if you decide to do that, what's driving that process is not necessarily political actors. Political actors may decide to make that possible. But then it's economic actors that are going to drive it. Right? Because if I say I'm going to create free trade between, say, a group of states in this area, then all of a sudden economic actors take over. If I have a company that has trucks, I say this is great, because now we have to move things not just in my country, we have to move them all over. I want things to be open. And I'm going to buy trucks. I'm going to buy more trucks. And now I could buy them over here in the other country, because we have this market. And they're cheaper there. So it starts to go, and it starts to go. So what happens then in this process of integration is that it isn't only then trade, but then it also becomes about people and ideas. Because then in this regional group that you've now created, people start to move around. Best example is students. Right? They start to go to universities within this structure. In Europe we have Erasmus. So when my students go away for a semester, they come back with all kinds of new ideas and tell me how everything I'm doing is wrong, because in Spain they do it differently. And that's the way it should be. That's the process of integration, that changing expectations. And so then, it's not just about trade, and it's about people and ideas. But the key point is perhaps this one that's underlined, is that once you get this, and the process begins to take off, then it's not really so much about what states do. Right? It then becomes a social process. Economic actors, social actors, civil society begins to think differently. And they drive the process. And they start to make demands on states to say, hold on, we need to open things up even more. Because you just signed a trade agreement, that's not enough. Because if you just have a trade agreement, and I'm a doctor, but they don't recognize my doctor's degree in the other country, that's not good enough. What's the use? So let's push for more. So then, and those are the kinds of pressures that come from society. And that's a practical thing. I'll give you an example. In my country, we have a party in government called the Lega, that when they were in the campaign, they were saying, we're going to get out of Europe, we hate Brussels, we're going to get out of the euro, all of those things. And in very colorful and offensive language. They get to government, they go to the first European meeting, they stamp their hands on the table and saying, you people in Brussels have been blah, 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 we're going to get out. They come back and they're saying, we told them in Brussels. And what do Italians say? They say, what are you talking about? My son works in London. My daughter works in Berlin. I go on vacation, I have a house in Portugal. We can't get out. Are you nuts? I have a business. I trade in 14 different European countries. We can't get out. So now, we say, zitto, quiet. They never mention Europe again. Because what maybe starts as a political process, society takes over. And then the costs of getting out become too high. Look at what's happening in Britain today. The people have spoken. 52% said, let's get out. Then now the people have discovered if we get out, our medicine can't come. Because our medicine is all ruled by laws we agreed with Europe. They don't apply anymore. We can't get fruit and vegetables. We can't get meat. Because now we don't have laws anymore. The costs are going to be tremendous. And all those parents who thought their kids were going to go on Erasmus to Barcelona, Trento, Paris, and so on, are now saying, well, how come my children can't go? So, this is what we mean by this process. Once it takes off, states might want to do things, and they still can. This is the important point. They still can. But they will then have to really deal with society and who's going to win and who's going to lose if you try and undo that process. Another example. Came to power, said, I'm going to get rid of NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. Canada and Mexico are ripping us off. Never again. I'm going to show them who's boss. Right? So, gets to Washington. Of course he discovers that if he does that, the American automobile industry will shut down. Because the automobile industry in the United States has factories that go from Canada, USA, Mexico. So you have a production chain that's constantly going like this. So they told him, if you rip up NAFTA, our car industries, our car factories are going to shut down. So of course he didn't rip up NAFTA. He had to do something, so they renegotiated, and the only thing they changed was the name. It's now called the United States, Mexico, and Canada Agreement. That's all. Nothing changed. Because he knew he couldn't. The costs become too expensive. Okay. We're going to get to the theories, don't worry. So, just to give you a little background, as I said before, the theories of regional integration was talking about how interests were divided between two blocks. We saw these integration processes taking place in Europe, in Africa, parts of Latin America. So international relations, as theories of international relations, had to start to begin to ask themselves questions about, well, are those theories that are just about conflicting interests really useful? So it comes out of that. The key debates and about in theories about regional integration, and this is good news for you, is that you can just divide them essentially into two groups. on the one hand, what we can call supranationalists. Those are the theories that say, once we develop central institutions, that process that Haas was talking about, where we begin to shift expectations, slowly begins to take place. And what we created was this new structure called C, this regional structure that begins to have some autonomy of its own. Now, have any of you done any courses on international relations theories?
Yes.
Yes. Yeah. So you know that realists, right?
Yes.
Realists would say these supranationalists are living in cuckoo land. Right? They would say, yeah, okay, we have international organizations, international institutions, but they are not autonomous from states. They only let them do. Supranationalist theories, on the other hand, say maybe, at the beginning it's like that. But over time, those central institutions begin to gain some autonomy from states. And it's exactly that process that Haas said, that it begins to shift expectations. So, one group is called the supranationalists. The other group we can call the intergovernmentalists. And intergovernmentalists are realists. All they say is that we might have even intense integration like we have in the European Union. But at the end of the day, it's just an agreement between governments. Those central institutions might be helpful to make things work, so like the Commission in the Eurasian Economic Union, but it's not really what's driving the process. What drives the process for intergovernmentalists is the continued importance of states. Okay. Okay, we can skip ahead here. Okay, so this is basically saying the same things we just said about supranationalism and intergovernmentalism. And the key point here is intergovernmentalists argue that at the end of all of this process, states never really give up their sovereignty. No matter how much integration you have, the central institutions you have are not sovereign. Now, if we look at a case like the European Union, intergovernmentalists today have a hard time. Right? Because they might say, yes, yeah, but it's still Germany. Nothing happens unless Germany agrees, or Germany and France agree, and so on. About 3 weeks ago now, just to show how maybe they have a hard time, intergovernmentalists, there was supposed to be a merger between two large companies that produce trains. A French company and a German company. It was a French company taking over a German company. And France has this idea that our companies have to be national champions. And this is part of our industrial strategy. It's our sovereign right. The European Commission that decides on mergers between companies said no. This cannot happen because it goes against competition rules and so on. So you might say, well, it's just a little thing about train companies. It's not about train companies. Yeah, it is about train companies. But the real question is that a state like France, not a minor state like Italy, a state like France, a nuclear power, a central institution said, no, you cannot create this industrial giant that will be a leader in technology and so on. That's giving up some of your sovereign rights. Or if I go back to my example of my anti-European parties that came to power in Italy during the campaign, said, no, we don't care what they say in Brussels. When we come to power, we're going to spend as much money as we want. We're going to have deficits and debts that go through the roof. Of course, they went to Brussels, and as the expression we have in Italian, I think also in English, they came back with their tail between their legs because they don't have that power anymore. So, but we'll see in a moment whether this is the case. So, supranationalism says that states transfer certain rights or parts of their sovereignty to supranational institutions. And we'll see why we think that's the case. Okay. If we want to present these two approaches, intergovernmentalism and supranationalism, in a graphic way. Here we have a logic that says, the logic is essentially an economic one. And the economic logic is that the more we open up national economies, the greater will be the economic growth and welfare for everyone. So, why I'm cooperating is primarily because I see some kind of economic and social gain from. A bigger market makes it more efficient and makes it. But another logic is a different one. I'm not doing this primarily because of this. What I really want is peace and security. Maybe I get it by economic integration, but this is what I'm really doing. I want to solve a problem about my security. So if I come back to my example of European integration in the 1950s, there's two ways to understand why they decided to create first the European coal and steel community and then the European economic community. One argument is, and we'll see in a moment, it's called functionalism, is this because they realized that after the devastation of the war, the way to recover would be by creating an economic community. So they weren't really interested about this, and who was pushing for this was not just states, but economic actors, especially multinational corporations or transnational corporations. But another argument says, look, it wasn't about economics. It was, what do you do about Germany? Right? The problem that's been in Europe, at the center of Europe for 200 years, what do you do about Germany? So, you can decide and you say, well, after the First World War we said, we'll disarm Germany and we'll make it pay lots of money for causing World War I. That didn't work because then we had World War II. So another response and the one interpretation and one theory says it wasn't about economics. It was simply a strategic choice made by France, primarily, to say, how are we going to make sure that Germany doesn't attack us again? Well, let's start by integrating coal and steel. Because if they don't control coal and steel on their own, that is, we now have a community, nobody controls it, then their rearmament can't happen unless we're part of that process. If you can't produce steel, then you can't produce tanks. And the logic of it was always, according to this argument, the more we integrate Germany into Europe, the safer we will be. So, that same logic, for instance, was when the Berlin Wall fell, and Europe was debating what to do about the unification of Germany, and Germany was debating about not only the unification, but joining and creating the euro, the single currency. The French president, Mitterrand, didn't want Germany to be reunified because France was worried that, oh no, we're going back in history now. Germany's going to be reunified, and then all of what we've done for the past 40 years is going to go out the window, and we're going to be in conflict again. And Mitterrand was convinced by Helmut Kohl and by Margaret Thatcher to say, no, you need peace by cooperation. And what we need to make sure is that we have a European Germany and not a German Europe. So this logic is not about economic integration. It's about using economic integration as cooperation to guarantee that your own security will be intact, that no one will begin to challenge it. Because the argument is, if we now are part of a single market with a single currency, the idea that France and Germany would go to war is just absurd. It just doesn't make sense. What would be the reason for it? And so, just as a parenthesis, if you're following the debate about Brexit, and it's not an easy debate to follow because the British Parliament has gone completely crazy in the last 2 weeks, the fundamental issue is whether we will have peace in Northern Ireland by cooperation. As you know, Northern Ireland had essentially a civil war up until the late 1990s. In 1998, they signed the Good Friday Agreement, where both sides decided to give up the conflict, and the reason they did it was because there's no border anymore between Britain, or Northern Ireland, and Ireland. If Britain leaves the European Union, that border comes back, and we don't have peace by cooperation. So, those are two very different reasons why we might have integration. So what happens? So this is basically what I'm saying here, what I said before about this is Germany, and here it's about society coming together and driving forward a process. So now we're beginning to get to some of the different theories. And the fundamental theories that are based on this logic, and today we're just going to talk about functionalism and neo-functionalism, are those that say it's as society integrates we go forward, and here it's intergovernmentalism and possibly federalism, and that's what we're going to talk about today. Okay, I'm going to skip some of these and go straight to the discussion of the different approaches. Okay, the logic of economic welfare driving the process. Already in the 1940s, and maybe in your international relations courses, or maybe if you've done sociology courses, you've come across this name of somebody named David Mitrani. No? And if you remember, Mitrani said, in the modern society, how people think is different. We've always assumed that their most important factor in determining how they would behave and determining their interests was decided by national borders. And the basic premise of Mitrani's argument was, look, a German steel producer and a French steel producer have more in common with each other than each of them has with, say, the German with German farmers and the French with French farmers. They have more in common in terms of interests. They have also an interest in getting rid of the border between them. What? Because if I'm a steel producer and there's no border here, now I can get coal from here much cheaper. And I can produce cheap steel that's much cheaper. And I now have a bigger market to sell to. And what's even better is the bigger market makes me bigger, so I can compete with the rest of the world in a much better position. So if you think of it as an athlete, what this does is it trains you for a bigger competition. If you want to take on American competition, Chinese competition, Asian competition in industry, if you're going to have small little markets, then you're not training for the right competition. You're not going to be ready for it. You have to be ready. You don't just simply start to take on that competition without first training. So Mitrani's argument was, let's start by thinking about society in what he calls functional terms. So when I see society, I look out the window, I don't see Russia. What I see is maybe finance industry. I see agriculture. I see transportation. And so on and so on. And if I was on the Russian-Finnish border, I wouldn't see a border. I would see just agriculture, industry, finance, without the adjective of Russian or Finnish before. So Mitrani's argument was simply that what functionalism does is really about making sure that people's functional interests are served in the most efficient way possible. And in international relations, that means making national borders count for less and less. Not for everything, just on those functional issues. So, the European Union started as simply a coal and steel community. And in the European Union, we celebrate May 9th as Europe Day. Do you happen to know what happened on May 9th? it's not a glorious event. Maybe this is why the EU has a hard time having people being attached to it, because usually national holidays are about great battles, liberation, and so on. May 9th was the presentation of the Schuman Declaration to create a coal and steel community. That is the most boring event you could have to celebrate. But in European history, without that decision to have functional cooperation, we would not have the European Union today. Because what the coal and steel community was a function, an industry, and 6 states that decided to say, for this function, national borders do not count. Yes?
Excuse me, but there was some projects about the unification of Europe between the Schuman Declaration. For example, the Pan-Europe project of Coudenhove, the idea of the League of Nations, the declaration of 16 Christian parties of Europe to make this a free economic zone in Europe. It was a lot of ages before the Schuman Declaration. Why you celebrate just only the 9th of May?
Because the coal and steel community was the only concrete thing that came out of that.
Okay.
No, but you're right, and because that's a good point that illustrates Matrani's point. Matrani's point was to say, look, if you try to get sovereign states to today say, let's create a new political structure, a political union called whatever, it's not going to happen, because sovereign states don't give up sovereignty, and people don't give up loyalty. Matrani says, let politics play their game. Let's think about functional integration. But Matrani was writing theoretically. This was Jean Monnet, and who thought in this way. Okay, so functionalism basically says we can think of society along functional terms. Just let me make this one point, the last point about Matrani. Matrani makes this important point that says what matters are not states. What matters for citizens are not states, not politics, and so on. It's human needs. That is basic economic welfare is what matters. So Matrani's starting point for international order is that we should start thinking about how we meet those human needs rather than the needs of the state. And those human needs are going to be along functional terms. Now, we could have a whole class, and usually it is just a whole class, on functionalism, and his point is here that it's form. It's not form that matters. That is, it's not the kind of political structure we create that's important. What's important is functions. And that's the opposite of how states were created. If you think that first we created states, and then states started to do things, like organize an economy and so on. The argument is the opposite. First you figure out what are the human needs, how are they organized along functions, and then you think about the political structure to govern. I'm going to skip this because I'm going to go to neo-functionalism, because neo-functionalism is really important in terms of regional integration theory, is important in your course on Eurasian integration, because it gives us a series of hypotheses that we can almost test to see whether or not they work in integration. And it's the dominant theory right now in regional integration, largely because it's dominant in thinking about European integration. And again, the key author is that Ernst Haas that we mentioned before at the beginning, who talked about transferring loyalties. And that is neo-functionalism is really interested in actors, and in particular social and economic actors. And for neo-functionalism, they're the ones that drive not only integration, but they're the ones that change the behavior of states. They're the ones who begin to create pressure for cooperation. So when neo-functionalism says, if you remember that graph I said about the two logics, you can say, neo-functionalists say, you know what, we'll even concede to you that maybe states decide to cooperate for security reasons. An intergovernmental logic. But what neo-functionalism says is, when you start to create that cooperation, the really important actors in society begin to change their behavior. And they then start to create pressure on those states that were driven by this logic, but societal actors are driven by this logic, the logic of economic welfare. And that leads them to make all kinds of demands on states. And the key concept for neo-functionalism, and you may have come across this in international relations courses, is this idea of spillover. And what spillover means is simply that functionalism says you focus on a single function. And maybe that's how you start integration, by coal and steel. But then, because you have integration here, spillover means it's like you fill a glass and you start to pour water into it, and it reaches here and it spills over, right? So it spills over, then you have to maybe put another glass. And this fills up and then it spills over and you have to put another glass to catch more and more. And what the argument of neo-functionalism is that if you start, again I'll give the example of the European Union, you start with coal and steel. And what Haas argued was, once you integrated coal and steel, if you really wanted to get all of the benefits of integrating coal and steel, you probably should integrate industry. You say, okay, we're building all this steel, but we have our industries not efficient enough to make the best of it. And now our industrialists are saying, well, how come it's only the steel producers who get the benefits of having this big market? So then you have to push to industry. And then you realize, well, if we have coal and steel and we have industry, we probably need to maybe make sure that it's easy for all of these industrial products that we're now making with all of this cheap steel to travel within this market. And if I have train tracks in my country that are this wide, and you have train tracks that are that wide, then we don't get the benefits of the integration we have here. So maybe we need to integrate transportation. And then, once I've done that, you start to say, okay, what we really need now is maybe we need to have a common external trade policy. We need to have a customs union. Because if we're now having industrial products traveling throughout our union or our community, but France over here imports products from Japan with 10% taxes, and Italy imports it with 25%, then it's easy for me to just bring something into France and then send it to Italy. So we need to have a common policy. So now we have a customs union. And if you have a customs union, at a certain point, again, the spillover, there's pressure. We have to integrate more now. We need to maybe make it easier for not only industrial products, but for people, services, capital, and goods to move around. So now I need a single market. And so on. So the logic of neo-functionalism says, the more I integrate, the more I need to integrate. I can't stop. The President of the European Commission in 2000, Romano Prodi, said, European integration is like riding a bike. If you stop pedaling, you fall. So you have to keep pedaling. If you don't keep integrating, the European Union or integration will fall apart. So you need to, the logic of neo-functionalism is that you need to continue to push the boundaries of integration. So that's what the functional spillover is. But there's also a political spillover. That is, the more you integrate these functions, the more you need institutions to govern. You can't do it simply by intergovernmental agreements all the time. It's easy to have an intergovernmental agreement, states sitting around the table and doing just coal and steel. Maybe you could do coal and steel and agriculture. Maybe you can do coal and steel and agriculture and finance. Maybe you can do coal and steel, agriculture, finance, and environment. But already it's getting very complex. So now you need central institutions. And so that's what Haas talks about political spillover. That definition we had at the beginning, where you begin to change your expectations to a central institution. And that central institution governs this functional spillover. I'll mention another kind of spillover is a geographic spillover. Because what Haas didn't talk about, but what's happened in practice, is that states then that are on the border of this union, they too start to say, yes, but we'd like to get in there as well. Because before we used to trade with here, but now we can't trade with them anymore. Or maybe, not that we can't trade with them, but now because they're part of this union, their focus is somewhere else. So it's better for us to join. So we think about the states that are now in some of the states in the Balkans. where because Croatia, Slovenia joined the European Union, they feel that that some of their traditional commercial links are no longer applicable. So neo-functionalism says it's this process and it's society that takes over. So just the key concept, and here we've talked all about it. But the last one is perhaps the one that is more important, is that eventually neo-functionalists argue a new political community takes over. Because our loyalties, our expectations now are at the European level. So, as an Italian, if my monetary policy is now made at the European level, if my commercial policy is made at the European level, if basically all of my fiscal policy is made at the European level, and a lot of my foreign policy is made at the European level, what's more important to me, the Italian state or the European Union? And over time, neo-functionalism argues this is what takes over. Now, that's the theory. Whether that really happens is something else, and maybe if we had a whole course we could deal with them. I don't have time to go through all of these because I want to get to I'll even skip federalism, and I just want to talk about intergovernmentalism because we're running out of time. So intergovernmentalism simply says that integration is not driven by those societal interests, and it doesn't change the calculation of actors. And again, from your international relations courses, you know about this concept about whether we think the system is zero-sum or positive-sum. So neo-functionalism says it's positive-sum, right? That when we cooperate, everybody gains. Some might gain more than others, some might gain less, but it's not that because I gain, you lose. Intergovernmentalism, on the other hand, is a zero-sum game. I cooperate so long as I am sure, not that my absolute position changes, but I am sure that my relative position is not weakened. That is, that others don't gain and get ahead of me. So, I'll give you an example from a debate we're having in my country now about the euro and about economic integration. So those who support economic integration and the euro say, look, Italy's economy is not growing. The reason it's not growing is not because of the euro, it's because of things that are going on in our own country and so on. Look at Spain. Spain's economy, they have the euro, and they're doing well. And not only that, our economy might not be growing like everybody else, but we are better off today with the euro than we were 25 years ago when we had the lira. So that's a positive sum. I'm saying, look, the average Italian is better off today than they were 25 years ago. The average Spaniard, somebody in Spain, might be much better off, but it doesn't matter. We're all gaining. The opponents say that doesn't matter that we're better off today than we were 25 years ago. others are catching up to us and passing us. It's a zero-sum game for them. So it doesn't matter what the absolute position is. What's important is that we are now weaker with respect to Spain, maybe perhaps other European countries like Poland and so on. So intergovernmentalists think in terms of states and how much power they have. And for them, it's about the national interest. And it's the rational calculations of national states pursuing their national interests that drive them. So if we go back to this, intergovernmentalism, as I mentioned before, is realism. And their argument is that states will take part in integration so long as they can be sure that they are gaining and their national interest is being protected. So in the case of the United Kingdom, the Brexit vote was a decision that said we no longer believe that it is in our national interest to integrate. And intergovernmentalists would say that's perfectly normal and a logical decision. It might not be the right one, who knows? But if you think that your national interest is served better by being outside the European Union, then you should be out. Okay. I've talked about 1 and 3. Number 2 is important for intergovernmentalism. Like realism, intergovernmentalism says you should never have behavior decided by ideology. Your behavior, you should only act on the basis of the national interest. And by ideology here, it doesn't mean the ideology of communism, nationalism, whatever. The ideology might be the ideology of integration. Right? Believing in European integration is an ideology. In the same way as liberalism is an ideology. It's a political project. And what intergovernmentalists say is that states should never act on the basis of ideology. If you remember your courses from realism, Morgenthau said that states are immoral if they act on any basis that isn't rational and on the basis of protecting national interest. So it's important for intergovernmentalists to say we shouldn't pursue integration just because we think integration is a good thing. It isn't. It has to be in our interest. And we don't do it just because we think we're European and so this is what it means to be European. Actually, I'm not sure we have time to talk about ideas. We only have about 3 minutes left. Maybe I'll just leave some time for if you have any questions more than talk about constructivism.
Yes, but I have a lot of questions about the domestic policy of the European Union because it's my sphere of, I don't know, scientific interest. Because, first of all, as we well know, at the end of March there will be an election to the European Parliament.
Yes.
And a lot of people, I think, will support the far-right parties with their own opinion about the European Union, about their position about the immigration process in the whole Union. Do you think that it means that the idea of big Europe and the idea of the Europe of two speed is broken up? because a lot of people are voted for people who wants to leave the euro. Exactly.
It's a good question. I go back to the beginning. I said, what do we need theories for? Theories also help us maybe predict the future, no? Or not predict, but what we should expect. And here, it's simply, if I believe that the most useful map is neo-functionalism, my argument would be those far-right parties are going to say a lot of things. They can be very colorful, they can say lots of offensive things and so on. But at the end of the day, it's going to be like the far-right parties or the anti-European parties in my country. Somebody's going to say, yeah, but my son is studying in Barcelona. My other daughter is working in Greece. You mean they're going to have to come back home? Are you going to have a job for them? No. So neo-functionalism would say, or that logic of institutions is that you reach a point where coming out of the European Union is just too hard. And this is why the debate about Brexit is so important for the rest of Europe. Because Europe wants to make sure that Brexit would not be easy. Because if it was easy, then everybody else, those far-right parties, can say, look, they did it, no problem. They can still come and work here. No, that's not going to happen. On the other hand, if we think that what really matters is domestic politics in the countries, more than even what the logic of integration has done, then those parties will push ahead regardless of what those costs will be. But I would also add this, is to not give the European Parliament more importance than what it is. I mean, it's an important institution, but not one that is going to change the nature of integration in one way or another. Yes?
Thanks a lot for your lecture. It was really interesting and fruitful. But I have one question. Right in the beginning, you said that theories are like maps. But the real practice is a lot wider than maps, because the real cases, theories are made out of practice, and they are like a conceptualized map of the practice. And I have one question. For example, if the politician is not truly concerned about these international theories, like for example Rex Tillerson, he was like a really good businessman, and if we try to observe his international relationship style, it's more of a business path. The way he made up the communication between countries and its leaders, he talked about, and so on. And it's rather far from the realist maybe and the liberal paradigm of international relationships.
It's a very good question. I used to have a professor who used to always remind me that the map is not the territory, right? That I look at a map and it says one thing, and then I look outside, it's not the same thing. But what's important for me for the map? To reproduce exactly what's outside, or to give me an efficient way to get to where I want to go. And so that's how we should assess all of these theories, right? Not whether they reproduce exactly what they do, but whether I find them useful to understand what's going on, right? So, but obviously you're all right, is that if the map keeps getting it wrong, it doesn't have to be the territory, but if the map says, I have a map that says that there should be a road, I should take this road here, but when I get on the road I find that there's a valley over there and I can't get across, it's not a useful map. So the cases are obviously important. Now, in the case of Tillerson, I think what these theories, both these and international relations, talk about is not so much the style, whether they're business leaders or not, and so on. But mainly, what drives their behavior? What's the logic of their behavior? And I mean, I don't know the Tillerson case well enough, but my guess is that given that he was part of a presidency that was about America first, it was really driven by the logic of these interests. But I don't know enough about
So
it.
he was just like a product of this machine, and he had to follow the rules.
Well, again, I don't know the case, but what I'm saying is that in pursuing interests, actors can use different styles, right? One might be more business-like, one might use the protocols of diplomacy, and so on. And what I'm more interested in is what's the logic of their behavior.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, another question, yes, about the domestic policy of Italy, especially. As we well know, there are some conflict between Italy and France right now because since the World War II, the French call out their ambassador from Italy and say that I don't know, that you are not good man and you are provoke us and doing something very bad. And Matteo Salvini, the Minister of Interior Defense, I think, yes.
Yes.
Also, I think he is a great counselor of the whole.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Vice President.
Yeah, most time. He said that there is no conflict and Italy want to cooperate with France, but in the other, I don't know, treaty position because he thinks that the whole Italy position in the European Union are weak, as you say.
But it,
Yeah, and my question is, should Italy, I don't know, put on European Parliament just one question of, I don't know, the recapturing of the Lisbon Treaty and the whole system of Europe, because I don't know if the major country of Europe say that our position are weak, something is wrong.
Okay, we need a whole class to answer that question. I'll just say very briefly, in that event, again, lots of noise, but then France sent back the ambassador, and both to Salvini and to those who started the conflict with France and Italy, it was reminded to them that last year there was 75 billion euros of trade that went between Italy and France. That matters more than the politicians.
So money goes first.
Not money goes first, is that it comes back to that point I raised at the beginning about expectations change. Okay, if I have a small business in Piedmont on the French-Italian border, what happens in Rome is not important to me. What happens is what's important is that border stays open. Okay. I think we have to stop. Is that it?
Okay.
Thank you very much.
So thank you very much.